Hi everyone, my name is Gabi and I'm a developer at the Get Shit Done team at Shopify. For the ones who don't know, Shopify is an e-commerce platform based in Canada and we're currently hiring. So if you're interested in coming to Canada, let me know, send me a tweet, and we can talk about it. I had invited for this talk a very special guest. His name is Volmer, and he basically kickstarted the whole code style effort at Shopify. But he was not able to make his trip to Canada from Canada to Brazil, so he's not here today with us. But yeah, I hope he sees it one day, and then maybe he comes next year. Before we go on with this talk, I just want to clarify a couple of things. Just to get this out of the way, I'm not here to try to convince anyone to make your code style consistent at your work. I'm here to share with you the history of code style at Shopify. We'll go through the things that worked and things that didn't work. So if you decide to do a similar effort where you work, you can tackle some of those issues before they even come up. So let's go back to the beginning. Our first Git commit was in 2005, and it was made by our CEO and founder, Toby. It actually all began in 2004 in SVN. Over those 13 years of history, we can notice two things. First is that we have a lot of code in our code base. You can see here that today we have over 700,000 lines of Ruby code in our code base. And the second thing is that we have over 400 Rails developers working at Shopify. The majority of them work in our Shopify, in our main code base. If we look at our repo of those 12 years in GitHub, we have contribution from 800 people from different departments, not only developers, but also content writers, designers, our support staff also code sometimes. And we're growing. So what does this mean for code style consistency? You probably already heard that Shopify is one of, if not the biggest Rails shops in the world. This means that we come across some very unique problems and we have to come up with a lot of creative solutions. Keeping 700,000 lines of code consistent has been a pretty wild job, but why is that? The first question we had to ask ourselves was, do we really want to make our code base consistent? And I think that's where the question always starts. Imposing a single code style actually goes against what the Ruby language was intended to do. In an interview, Matt, the creator and designer of the Ruby language, shared that the intention of the language is to be a fun language to work with that allows a user to choose whether they want to write it in a certain style or in another, not like other languages that impose a style. At the same time, Ruby has evolved and it has changed, so some styles no longer work and some are not used anymore. To exemplify this, we can look at the hash rocket syntax that has been mostly replaced by a newer syntax. And this all relates back to the fact that Shopify was never rewritten in these last 13 years. And in this lies the issue that all of those outdated styles are still part of the code base. So it makes it old-fashioned at best, but very inconsistent at worst. So let's dive into some history here. Our codebase was born in 2004. It was a new app using a new framework, and it had only a very few people working on it. At this point, no one was really worried about code style and consistency in our codebase. 2005 came about, Shopify started using Git, and everyone was working really hard to make the app grow and add new features. 2006 came about, 2007. And so on and so on and so on. Until 2012, when we did look again at code style, we had a lot more developers and a much bigger code base, and it was aging. So Toby, our CEO, created a draft style guide for Shopify with a half dozen rules as a guideline for our developers. Things were really busy though, and the whole style conversation was put aside again until 2014. Not much more effort was done around code style until then. In September, we introduced Rubocop Gem to our code base to deal with very basic code style rules such as white spaces. If you don't yet know Rubocop, it is an open source Ruby gem that analyzes your code statically and serves as a linter following many of the code styles defined by the community for the Ruby community. While the intention was great, this is what happened. We had an already big code base. It was 10 years worth of code that had never ever been linted, so we had many violations, so it all exploded. Many rules were then disabled because it was not feasible to correct all the violations at the same time. Instead of running Robocop through the entire code base, we needed to find another solution to stop the bleeding. So we needed something that would only look through violations that were newly being added to the code, or to the code that was just being written then, or anything that was being changed. This is when the Polício gem came about. Polício, in Portuguese, policial, is a wrapper built around Robocop that only runs on pull requests and accuses code style violations in code that was added or newly or just changed. It was inspired by the Hound tool made by Thoughtbot, but adapted to Shopify's needs and constraints. Polício listened to events using GitHub webhooks, and whenever a pull request was created, it would comment all over the pull request with any code style violations that were found. The team was not very impressed about it. The tool was very noisy, and it added a lot of comments to a pull request. Despite the noise, they continued using it, but that meant that we were in for some very much needed improvements. October 2005 was quite an eventful month, where two new big changes came about. Looking for other solutions, we thought about using the commit status API in GitHub instead of commenting on choosing pull requests to convey code style violations. Much like a CI status, Polício status changes depending on where it found any violations in your pull request. If no violations were found, it would be green, just like you can see here. And if you did find some violations, however, it would turn red, and you could click in the details button to look at the list of violations. It brings you to this page where you can actually see all of your style violations, the lines where they occur, and the details on what the violation is and how you could fix it. This feature was actually an opt-in from the beginning, so for our developers during this time, so they could choose whether they signed up or not. Even though the tool wasn't perfect just yet, we saw great adoption rate. By the beginning of 2016, over 50% of our developers had already opted in. And the second thing was that, along with the Polício app, the Shopify Ruby style guide came to life, describing more details about our style preferences, what the style preferences at Shopify were. With that, the rules that would violate the code styles were described in our style guide were now added to the list of rules that actively being investigated in pull requests. The guide was meant to set expectations for our Ruby developers, not only in terms of code style, but also how they encourage to take ownership of their code and decide for themselves where exceptions were actually reasonable. More important than those expectations, the guide offered plenty of examples of what matches our code style and what doesn't. So it removes any guessing necessary by the developer. So you don't have to be thinking about, oh, should it be this way or that way? We show an example, you can quickly find it and see it in the style guide. A few months into these changes, a survey was sent out to all the developers at Shopify to find out what was good, what was bad, and what was ugly of Polício and the style guide implemented so far. So I'll share some of those results with you. One of the questions we asked was if developers believe that Polício had a positive role in our pull requests. Most developers had felt that Polício was playing a very beneficial one to our development. They also said that they were learning from Polício and the style guide. And again, with an overwhelmingly positive response, devs thought Polício was bringing value to our code base. We also looked at specific feedback. They were able to write down things that they liked and things they didn't like. So let's talk about the negative feedback first. The rules weren't clear. It wasn't clear to some people how are those rules actually improving our code base, and it was confusing that different projects had different styles. A common negative feedback as well revolved around pull requests taking a lot longer to be merged because they would have to clean up and ask for more rounds of reviews. Most daunting of all was that people complained of it making files even more confusing than it actually was before. And how was that possible? Since Policia was only searching for violations in lines of code that were changed or newly added, it also creates some inconsistency. Like I show you here an example where an existing line that was not changed for a while could have some old style, like line 2, but a new one being added would have to have the new style, like line 3. So they were very inconsistent. But let's talk about the positive feedback now. Some thought that the enforced style made the code much more readable, more predictable, and it made it easier for onboarding new developers, especially those coming from different languages. It allows developers to focus more on thought-intensive tasks, like writing and reviewing patterns and logic instead of code style. The responses were overwhelmingly positive, but they were not just opinions. They came from real developers who used the tools and saw those benefits. Not everything was awesome then, so we had a lot of improvements to implement still. With such a great response, we went ahead and activated Policia to investigate all the pull requests from Shopify Codebase. Other apps could also be set up to use Policia as well. Given the not-so-perfect nature of the tools being used at the time, Policia was set up to not fail a build, and pull requests could still be merged even though it had some code style violations. This wasn't great because some developers would just, ignore those violations and merge their code anyway, but most didn't, and it was useful for the time being because code could still be merged in an emergency, especially since violations were not being auto-corrected then. So the first phase was done. We had Policia running to catch any future violations. Part 2 was ahead of us though, fixing violations that were already in the code so that those rules could fail the build in CI if any violations were introduced. So now acquainted with the Robocop gem and the Policia gem, we took the effort some steps further. Some files were manually corrected so that certain rules could be enabled in CI, failing the build if new violations were added. Some of those rules are autocorrectable, like replacing double quotes by single quotes, but some rules are very difficult to autocorrect, like line length, like where do you actually break a line? How does the tool decide where to break a line? And we decided to use tools. We had the tools that we had to improve other parts of our development effort. At the time, we were upgrading the Rails from 4.2 to 5.0, and a lot of the deprecations were being removed by our Rails team, and then developers would just go and add them back. So we added those. Hello. Oh, it's back. So they added custom rules to prevent people. Hello. Oh, I'm back. So they added custom rules to prevent people from adding new deprecations to the code base. One example of a Rails rule is this one that checks if behaviors are being added directly to the framework classes, but instead should be using the onload hook provided by the framework. This rule was autocorrectable, so our developers found it very helpful. With the success that we found so far, we were ready to run it through the entire code base. We had the perfect plan. The step 1, we would first run all the autocorrectable rules to the entire code base. We did it, so it was done. Step 2, we would decide on a development downtime so that we could merge all the pull requests with minimal conflict. We chose the weekend because it's a time when there's not a lot of development going on, so not many people would be coding. Step 3 would be to inform our developers what was going on in advance so they could merge any pull requests they had opened before Friday so that they could minimize conflicts in their own pull requests. Otherwise, they would likely want to murder us on Monday when they came in and had to rewrite pretty much everything. So then we would make their lives easier. And step 4 would be to merge all of those pull requests that we had opened, and we would have a linked code base, yay. So next weekend came about. Okay, it didn't happen, obviously, but why not? It was the perfect plan. Why did we not go through with it? We came across a few blockers. First one would be Git blames would be much harder to do because the code style fix commits would pollute the history by adding history that was not necessarily related to the functionality of the code. At Shopify, we also believe in ownership. Whenever you touch some code, that means that now you own that. Because someone was making those pull requests, now some of those pull requests had thousands and thousands of lines. Now they would be responsible for those lines, and they would be pinged all day long for requests when they needed to, like, people need to ask questions about those. So that meant that code style fixes would make one or two people responsible for most of the code base. So we came to also realize what a week at Shopify time meant. With Shopify deploying around 30 times a day back then, today is a lot more, a week's time was enough for a massive amount of code to have changed and make the pull requests we had prepared actually to have several conflicts just after less than a week. And we had a lot of new violations too. So we were definitely not ready. We closed all the pull requests, we closed the issue, and we had to give it a lot more thought. All our problems were still there though. Policia was working, but the code was becoming more consistent. But by no means the tools were making work easier for our developers. Some of the issues were we were enforcing rules that weren't clear or that didn't seem as beneficial. All rules were enabled by default, and these that we actually didn't want were then disabled. To minimize the frustration among our developers, we followed Rails steps and changed our strategy to actually only add roles that we actually wanted by default. This new strategy allowed us to discuss whether we should add a new role to our style guide instead of discussing whether we should remove it because it wasn't working well. So in January this year, GitHub added a new feature that allows you to easily look at the history of a single line, and that came to be a very important feature that led us out to our next try. This is what the feature looks like. A few months had passed, and the new strategy for rules were working quite well. Developers were a lot more receptive to having a style guide, and they were confident that while the journey hadn't been all rainbows and butterflies, we were getting to a better place. So we decided we were ready to try again and use Rubocop autocorrect feature to fix all violations through the entire codebase. This time we were using a bot, so no one would be pinged for owning the entire codebase. For the violations that were already autocorrected, the -A Rubocop flag was added to our internal development tool so that it could easily autocorrect their own code before pushing it. Knowing that the rest of the code base was clean, they would for sure know that new violations were being added by them at that point. So this has allowed us to add each one of those rules that were being autocorrected to our test suite so that the build would fail when new violations were being added. Here's a list of all of the ones we had fixed. Of course, we had an issue. One of the biggest issues we found when adding new rules to our test suite was that linting our entire code base was taking a lot more time than actually our slowest test. We temporarily fixed this issue by removing huge migration files from the inspected files, but it was not a long-term solution. But anyway, it allowed us to continue moving forward with our effort at that point. Some components in our code have been completely linted and are now being fully checked at build time. So let's talk where we're at today and where do we need to get to. We currently have 2 Rubocop configuration files, one for autocorrectable violations being forced in CI and one for all other rules. In the future, we want to go back to having just one Rubocop definition with all the rules being checked in CI. Each developer has to run Rubocop autocorrect command locally before pushing their code up to the repo, which is frustrating. Why should we do something that the computer already knows how to do so well? Our goal is to enable the autocorrect when a developer pushes a pull request. So instead of making the build fail automatically, the bot would make a commit in the pull request with all the corrections applied, so that the developers don't have to do it manually by themselves. Developers are very impatient creatures, as you probably already know. Linting can't possibly take longer than running tests. So we are implementing caching strategies to improve the performance when all the rules are enabled. Rubocop has recently added, maybe a year ago or so, added this new functionality where you can actually cache, use caching to prevent it from running in the entire code base and just look at things that have changed. A lot of the issues that we encounter are new, and while we tackle them, it's important to also push these changes upstream so that the community can also benefit from improved tools. Since we have a lot of big problems and we have to come up with new solutions, we take it to heart to actually make those available to the projects themselves and to the libraries themselves. So we try to contribute back to Rubocop and Polisho so that we can give back to the community in that way. We want to continuously improve our guide. We can in that way we can give developers more context and clarity to our preferred styles, and allows all our developers also to make better informed decisions. And to close this up, let's look at some takeaways. Have a place where others can ask about the guide and the rules when they're not obvious. And this brings me to my next point. In many places, Rubocop actually allows you to choose which style to use, in a given rule. So you can study your code base and talk to other developers on your team and to decide on which ones are right for your project. Ruby is a language that should be flexible enough for you to use it the way works best for you. The community style guide and the Ruby linter allow you to make those calls and decide on what's best for your project and your code base as well. So here I show an example of, it's from the Rubocop Jam documentation, and it shows two different things that can be done differently, and it's basically your choice. There's no right or wrong. The process of bringing a code base to consistency is not an easy one, especially in a community that values creativity in code so dearly. Allow for discussions to happen among your developers. Not all rules will work for all code bases, and it's important to allow for this to surface. Your tools have to be somewhat ready, and they have to be somewhat functioning, so that you don't annoy all of your developers and then people are not interested in your effort anymore. Keep at it. It's not an easy process. The time is never going to be perfect, but once it's good enough, don't give up. Talk to others. Learn more about your tools so that you know what can and can't be done, and tackle one problem at a time. But most importantly, have fun. Thank you. I know that there are questions and answers on Twitter. I won't look through them right now, but I'll reply them during the day or after the talk if you want. Yeah.